Okay. Well, to start, could I just have you introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name is Ahmad Washington. I'm assistant professor in counseling, school counseling at the University of Louisville. And this is my first STK conference, and I'm very, very, very much looking forward to coming back.
That's awesome. This is my first STK interview. So,
Okay.
I've actually recently started here at the Ford again after 10 years out of school.
Okay.
Looking to be a teacher. So I was really looking forward to interviewing both of you guys, just because it kind of touches base a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a little bit of background on me while I ask these questions, though.
Okay.
I'm a I have a disability, learning disability, and I'm Hispanic, Irish, Scottish. So kind of come from a low poverty family. A lot of those deficits and things, throughout life that we were talking about. But first, just because I don't feel like a lot of people, like you were saying, know what hip hop is. Would you be able to define that just for kind of the everyday?
Yeah. So hip hop for me is like sort of an amalgamation of different cultural practices that take their origin, people who like African origins that found their way in the Caribbean. You think about like some of the people who contributed to hip hop in its early incarnation. I think of like Kool Herc and his Afro-Caribbean influences. But if you think about the modes of the expressions of hip hop, the improvisation, if you think about the use of words and the griots, if you think about voice and you think about sound as aspects of the African identity, the unknown about African spirituality. And it's impossible to understand hip hop culture as a mode of expression, as an embodiment of Africanness and Africanity. It's impossible to understand it without having that historical background. In terms of like contemporarily in this country, I think about hip hop as a mode of resistance to racial and economic, systemic institutional racism, institutional oppression as it existed in the Bronx in the late 1960s, right? So, and the other part that often gets overshadowed is the fact that what we call hip hop is a function of communities coming together and demanding that violence, intracommunal violence, actually cease and desist. So if you've seen The Warriors or if you've seen Rebel Kings, they go into great detail about Black Benji and his death and the group that he belonged to, thinking about and contemplating an act of vengeance and revenge for his death, and Black Benji's mom being very, very intentional, saying that if you go seeking retribution, then you're sort of undermining what this whole this conference, this convening of games was all about. So when I think about hip hop, I think about all of those different things, the cultural influences that trace their traditions back to the continent of Africa, the influences in the Caribbean, and also as a mode of anti-hegemonic sort of resistance.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I really like what you had to say. I actually know some of the connections, which surprises me. So I don't know too much hip hop. I mean, closest I got to any of the background was watching NWA or.
Oh, Straight Outta Compton?
Yeah, Straight Outta Compton.
Okay.
That's the name of the movie.
Yeah.
So kind of just off the wall with that. So the interpretation of Fuck the Police in that movie by a lot of the kids that I work with. I'm also a school bus driver.
Okay.
It's more rather than what the movie portrayed, Fuck the Police because they're out against us racially, things like that. It's more conceptualized as fuck them because they're just telling me what to do. It doesn't matter anything about any of that. Well, I mean, what would you say hip hop lyrics and things like that? Do you think that there's a misunderstanding by the people that are listening to them?
Oh yeah, I mean, because we're still talking about things that have like multiple, like nuanced, different interpretations, conclusions. It's about what do you interpret that lyric to mean, that image to mean, and not understanding them like compartmentalized and discrete and separate from one another. But how do you understand and interpret that lyric, that bar, in conjunction with the video that may have accompanied it, the packaging, the actual narrative of the person who's performing it. Like, all of those things matter and inform how I perceive and what I glean from whatever this product is. The thing that interests me about Straight Outta Compton is how much they left off in terms of really highlighting the role of the CIA and government agencies in undermining the integrity of black communities. And my work with the Urban League back in Louisville, that was one of the things that we wanted to accomplish by connecting hip hop to social justice and social activism, is saying that the people who are oftentimes disparaged in the popular media around the graphic nature of the content of their lyrics, many of those conversations and that pushback, that resistance, was rooted in a very real understanding, a very deep familiarity with the types of oppression that is articulated in those lyrics. So the issue is not necessarily with what the music isn't doing. It's the adults in the room who lack the requisite understanding about that context.
Okay.
Compton 1980s.
Yeah.
And what contributed to it. So do you understand the nuances of redlining and deindustrialization, and the fact that scores and scores of black people left the South seeking refuge in the West and finding Jim Crow West? Like, all of those things have to be part of the equation to help young people sort of make sense of the music that they listen to. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, and just kind of more on your educational background. I'm a little curious of what you'd say your educational philosophies are.
Educational philosophies are greatly informed by Paulo Freire and pedagogy of the press. Far from like, my classrooms aren't what I would consider what I want ideally in terms of like mobilizing critical pedagogy and critical practice, but this demanding that students ask questions. Like, just when you think that you've found the solution or you've isolated the issue, asking subsequent questions. I think about peeling the onion, and making sure we peel it as far as we could possibly peel it. And then demanding that, and again, it goes back to what I'm doing with school counselors, is asking them to ask, where does power reside and who possesses power? If we're talking about in schools, power means who has the floor, who dominates conversation, who is monopolizing the airspace, and whose voices are rarely heard or acknowledged, right? Or how those voices and how those bodies are being problematized, pathologized, and then criminalized. And how does that happen in very nuanced and subtle ways, right? So we think about the ways that students are actually like physically removed from schools, but are we critiquing the language that makes that more violent removal possible? And that's what I want my students to think about, because in having those sorts of that reflexive, introspective conversation, they recognize the ways that they are complicit with what it is that they say they're trying to undo.
Okay. All right. So kind of more of a critical theory philosophy is what you would ideally have your class set up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah.
Critical theory is
and it
my
doesn't
thing.
it doesn't find its way into school counseling, which is
Yeah.
I'm trying most times to introduce things to my students that haven't been framed and packaged and presented to them in that way.
Okay.
So,
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
no, that's it. I appreciate
All right.
the
Well,
time.
yeah.
Thank you
Very much. I appreciate
No
it.
problem.